Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we're going to be taking a look at a subscriber deck submitted to us by Sir Onimo. So it is a Jund ramp deck called Confetti because we can actually ramp into one of the new Armenket cards cut to ribbons. Ribbons, confetti, get it? So it's essentially a typical ramp deck, except for it contains a lot of X related things like ribbons to deal X damage to each opponent, board wipes like Earth to deal X damage to each creature without flying, so essentially it's a board wipe in this deck. And we're essentially using retreats as well to make use of those extra land drops while we do ramp. So, if we go right to the beginning of the deck, we've got ourselves Walking Ballista. So this is one of the X cards that we can cast. So it's X and X, so for each 2 mana you spend, you essentially get to put a 1/1 counter on Walking Ballista. If we've got all of our mana out, we can make this guy a 4/4 or even a 6/6. That kind of thing. And we can also pay 4 mana as well to put an additional counter on him. So other than the counters, of course, what can we do with Walking Ballista? Well, we can actually remove +1/+1 counters from it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. So we can use this to get rid of our opponent's tokens or their little creatures, whatever it is that's stopping our big creatures from getting through. So if we've got a massive like 17/4 Zendikar Incarnate, but they've got a load of plant tokens, we could use Walking Ballista to ping them all to death. There is also a little bit of synergy as well with Retreat to Hagra. So Retreat to Hagra has the ability, we'll get to the rest in a bit, but the first ability allows you to give it +1/+0 and Death Touch until the end of the turn. So if you give Death Touch to the Walking Ballista, whenever Walking Ballista deals 1 damage to a creature, it actually deals it in Death Touch terms as well. So removing a single counter could take down a 12/12. As long as it doesn't have indestructible or hexproof, we can target all of our opponent's creatures. This can also become a board wipe in that sense as well, which is pretty awesome. We then have Jadi Offshoot, so this is one of our early game defense mechanisms against aggro and stuff like that. It's a 1 mana 0/3 with defenders, so it can't attack. However, it does have landfall that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may gain 1 life. So we play this guy on turn 1, turn 2 we play a land, we gain a life. And then eventually we start getting into things like retreats and getting extra value from them as well. So it's just that little bit of early game life gain against aggro decks. The 0/3 allows you to block a lot of things in the early game as well, so you can protect your life total quite well with these guys. Really helps us get to where we need to be, and the early game is not where we need to be. So we've got after that Nissa, Vastwood Seer. So for 2 and a green, we've got a 2/2 legendary creature. Whenever she enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. So we can allow us to use our landfall on that as well. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you have 7 or more lands, then you get to exile her, return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control. So really benefits in the early game to get us a land out of our deck to thin, but also to ramp later on as well. If we haven't got a card in hand, it allows us to hit our land drops, that kind of thing. It's not necessarily ramp in that sense, but you know. It allows us to hit our land drops more consistently, and as soon as we got 7 lands, we get a Planeswalker out of it, so the ramp side of the deck really helps with Nissa as well. So she's a 3 loyalty Planeswalker. The first ability says +1, reveal the top card of your library. If it is a land, you put it onto the battlefield, essentially ramping. Otherwise, it goes into your hand as card advantage. So if it's a land, it goes on the field. If it's an Ulamog, it goes into our hand, and we've essentially taken the top card off of our deck as well, so we get to go a little bit further deeper into our deck a lot faster. The -2 is our way of protecting ourselves. It says -2, put a legendary 4/4 green elemental creature token named Ashaya the Awoken World onto the battlefield. So 4/4 is pretty good at blocking almost all of the creatures in the format, other than of course big rampy creatures, but that allows her to keep her safe. Takes her down to 1 loyalty if you take her straight from Planeswalker mode into the -2. But that 4/4 should be able to stop most threats on the board. Most of the time, though, we want to be using the +1. If we do use the +1 quite a lot, we manage to get to ultimate status, so we can -7. We get to untap 6 target lands. They become 6/6 elemental creature tokens that are still lands, so 6/6/6s is going to destroy our opponent if we get to that point. Most of the time it'll kill them in one go. If it won't, it'll kill them the turn after. It's pretty sweet. And Planar Outburst doesn't deal with this because it's all non-land creatures. Essentially those 6/6s survive board wipes as well, so there you go. We then have Tireless Tracker, yet another rampable creature, benefits from lands entering the battlefield. It is a 2 and a green for a 3/2 creature, which is pretty sweet. We probably want to be playing this guy on turn 4 though, because we want to be able to play him and get instant value out of him, because if our opponent does have removal, like a Shock or a Magma Spray, that kind of thing, then at least we get a clue from it. So whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you get to investigate, which essentially means you get to put a clue token onto the battlefield, and you can use that clue to pay 2, sacrifice it, and draw a card. So we get card advantage, essentially, from the Tireless Tracker. Also, whenever we sacrifice a clue, we get to put a 1/1 counter on the Tireless Tracker, which means he also gets a little bit bigger, which is really good for our ramp strategy as well. Next, we've got Retreat to Hagra. So we briefly touched upon this. It's really good to put Death Touch on creatures to force through some damage, but it's also for 1 and a black enchantment. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, we can also drain our opponent for 1 and gain 1 life as well. So this is our way of getting past our opponent if they've clogged up the board. Alternatively, we put use the first ability on a Walking Ballista, ping all of our opponent's creatures off the board to wipe that as well. It is a board wipe in a sense if we've got that 2-card combo going, which is pretty sweet. But yeah, it's really good value. Really good value. You can trigger it multiple times later down the line. Next we've got Retreat to Kazandu. So it's another retreat for 2 and a green enchantment with landfall. So whenever a land enters the battlefield, we either get to put a 1/1 counter on a target creature, so we get to make our creatures really big really quickly, or we get to gain 2 life. Yet again, also protecting us from aggro strategies. So in the early game, we want to be gaining as much life as possible to negate their board state. And then later down the line, we'll probably Heaven to Earth to wipe the board clear. That kind of thing. Speaking of Heaven to Earth, we've got 1 and an X instant speed. Heaven deals X damage to each creature with flying. If this isn't entirely relevant, which there is a good chance that it's not, we only have to pay 1 green to get into the graveyard. And from the graveyard, we can use Earth. Earth is a sorcery speed, red, red, and X. Can only be cast from the graveyard. It says Earth deals X damage to each creature without flying. So the more mana we have, the more damage we can deal to each creature on our opponent's board. This one's more likely to be relevant, so we'll probably Heaven for 0, Earth for like 6, that kind of thing. Wipe their opponent's board clear. A lot of our creatures can survive a pretty decent Earth. Like if we go Earth for 3, that wipes a lot of things out in the format, and we've got a lot of 4 toughness creatures, so we get to swing through our opponent's board then. Next we've got Read the Bones. So for 2 and a black sorcery speed, scry 2, draw 2, and lose 2. So this allows us to find all of our X-Burn spells and our big creatures as well, because the one thing that is really bad about Ramp is it tends to see a lot of lands, and finding the win conditions can be a little bit difficult, but Reader Bones allows us to find them there as well. We get to essentially look at the top 4 if we don't like the top 2, and find whatever we want from there. It's pretty sweet. Next we've got Mina and Den Wildborn. I should note that this is the only card that I've actually swapped in from the original build. Cruel Reality used to be in here, and I just didn't think it was that effective, so I ended up putting Amina and Den Wildborn instead, because I think it's got a little bit more synergy with the deck that way. So for 2, a red and a green legendary creature, 4/4, you get to play an additional land on each of your turns, which triggers landfall an additional time each turn. But we can also pay red and a green to return a land we control to our owner's hand, and then give a creature trample. So one of the downsides of the deck is we get some big creatures, but they don't have a way to push through damage, other than, of course, Rogue's Passage, which we can grab later down the line with an Uvenwald Hydra, that kind of thing. But with Amina and Den on the field, we can actually give our creatures trample and start pushing through their little chump blockers, which is really what we want to be doing. Speaking of big threats, we've got Zendikar Incarnate. So for 2, a red and a green, Zendikar Incarnate's power is equal to the number of lands you control. So at the bare minimum, it's going to be a 4/4, essentially. And the more lands we play, the bigger it gets, the bigger the threat it becomes, and we can just start pushing through damage later down the line with Rogue's Passage, giving it trample, that kind of thing. Also forcing chump blocks for days because this guy gets out of hand. And we've got 3 copies of him, so even if he does die through a trade, it's not too much of a problem because we're probably going to draw into one later down the line anyway. Next we've got Cut, so this is one of the win conditions for the deck, not this side but the other side. Cut is a 1 and a red sorcery speed that deals 4 damage to target creature, which essentially means it kills almost every creature in the format. Most playable creatures have got 4 toughness or less, for the most part, of course. There are exceptions to that, with your Uvenwald Hydras and your Ulamogs, that kind of thing. But what we really want to be doing is getting this guy into the graveyard, because then we get to cast Ribbons. So for double black and X sorcery speed, each opponent loses X life. So if we've ramped our entire deck, then we probably don't have many lands outside of the battlefield, and we can usually Ribbons for maybe 10, 12, that kind of thing. So we can do a lot of damage with this card and probably just win the game on the spot with it, which is pretty sweet. We then have Explosive Vegetation. This is our premium ramp spell, so for 3 and a green sorcery speed, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. So, turn 3, we probably play a Retreat. Turn 4, we play Explosive Vegetation. We have our land drop for the turn, which is a trigger for the landfall. We then have 2 extra land drops with the Explosive Vegetation. So that's an extra 2 triggers on our retreats. So we gain a lot of life. And Explosive Vegetation ramps us into our big creatures as well. We can then cast Uvenwald Hydras the turn after Nissa's Renewal. And we're not far off Sandworm Convergence then as well. So it's really important that you get an Explosive Vegetation on turn 4. Because it does just ramp you into all of your win cons, which is pretty sweet. We then have Obnixilis Reignited. So 3 and double black for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. The +1 ability allows us to gain a little bit of card advantage. We draw a card and lose 1 life. So as we mentioned, you get to the point eventually where you start just drawing into your ramp spells, and you don't want to see these. So Obnixilis allows us to push past those. So if we draw into an Explosive Vegetation when we have no lands in our deck, or maybe we just need to find an extra answer, the +1 allows us to do that. The -3 allows us to destroy target creature. It's essentially a murder on a Planeswalker. Allows us to get rid of our opponent's big threats as well. So if we're playing against Ramp or Reanimator, that kind of thing, our opponent's bound to have some big creature, we just straight up kill it with the -3. But the -8 is also one of the win conditions as well. It's a bit of a slow one, because we don't have many ways to make our opponent draw cards. In fact, we have no ways to do that. But we can also draw cards ourselves with Obnixilis. Target opponent gets an emblem with whenever a player draws a card, you lose 2 life. So every turn cycle, our opponent loses 4 life essentially, and if they draw additional cards, they lose an additional 2 life. If we draw additional cards, they lose an additional 2 life. So we can close out the game relatively slowly with this. It's not the primary win condition by any stretch of the imagination, but if we get there, then we probably do want to ultimate nonetheless. We then have Nissa Vital Force. Nissa does help with the Obnixilis win condition as well. So for 3 and 2 green, 5 loyalty Planeswalker. +1 ability is how she protects herself, which is really awesome because it allows her to get a little bit more powerful and keep her safe as well. We get to untap a target land we control, which effectively makes her 4 mana if we want to do that and not attack in with the Elemental. So we get ourselves a 5/5 creature essentially with haste that gets to swing in, which is not anything to turn your nose up at. The -3 allows us to return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So if for some reason they manage to deal with one of our big threats, Nissa can go and pull it back and we can cast it again. If they get rid of our Sandworm Convergence, we can get that back and cast it again. There's lots of value for that. But one of the really fun things to do with Nissa is to +1 her and then next turn ultimate her and get the emblem. So the emblem says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So if we ramp, Explosive Vegetation essentially becomes a draw 2 card and ramp 2 lands kind of thing. Our land drops also become card draw spells. So if we hit a land off the top, if we're top decking and we hit a land, normally that would be bad. But it actually is just essentially a redraw with Nissa's ultimate, which is pretty sweet. Allows us to find our win conditions. And with Mina and Den, we can maybe play 2 additional lands, draw 2 additional cards by bouncing our own lands. So there's a lot of synergy there as well. We then have Uvenwald Hydra, so it's 4 and 2 green for an XX reach creature. Uvenwald Hydra's power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control, so probably bare minimum, going to be a 6/6 creature. Well, actually, it's going to be a 7 because you do get to grab yourself a land as well. So we play this on turn 6, or even earlier than that if we've been ramping as well. We get to search our library for any land whatsoever, put it onto the battlefield tapped. Almost 9 times out of 10 you want to find yourself a Rogue's Passage, because Rogue's Passage allows the Uvenwald Hydra to become unblockable, which turns it into a pretty massive threat that needs to be answered almost immediately. And Rogue's Passage then allows us to enable things like our Zendikar's Incarnate also to get through. All of our creatures suddenly become unblockable creatures. Our 5/5 tokens from Sandworm Convergence, our Ulamog, which is a 2-turn clock at that point. It's pretty sweet once you've got yourself a Rogue's Passage. We then have Nissa's Renewal. This is our bridge to get towards our really expensive win conditions. So turn 4, we Explosive Vegetation into 6 mana. We then play a land to 7. Nissa's Renewal gets us 3 lands. Up to 10, we can cast Ulamog straight after on that turn. And until then, after we've got the 3 basic lands, which might also trigger our retreats as well, gaining us a ton of life, buying us a ton of time, gains us an extra 7 life on top of that as well. Even without lands in your deck, you will also gain 7 life, so it's still really good against aggro. It's not a dead card if you have no lands left in your deck, because you can still gain 7 life for 6 mana, which is not ideal, of course, but it's an option you have available to you. We then have Sandworm Convergence. So, one of the big things that we have a problem with is flyers. We can't block them. Sandworm Convergence gets around that perfectly. So, for 6 and 2 green, 8 mana total, we've got an enchantment that says creatures with flying cannot attack you or planeswalkers you control. So we automatically lock down anything that our creatures can't block, essentially. So suddenly our Zendikar's Incarnates become unbreakable walls that our opponent can't get through. And if we somehow don't have any creatures on the board, when we come to cast this, at the beginning of our end step, we also get ourselves a 5/5 green worm creature token, which will block almost everything that you could possibly imagine. And we can use that later down the line to start swinging in and forcing our opponent to chump block as well. Finally, we've got Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. What ramp deck is complete without one? 10 mana for a 10/10 legendary creature. Whenever you cast Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, exile 2 target permanents. So we can take out our opponent's lands. If they're playing a mill deck, we take out their tutelage. If they've got big creatures, we take down their creatures. If they've got an Ulamog, we exile their Ulamog. That kind of thing. It's also indestructible, which makes it really difficult to deal with. It won't die through combat damage. It won't die through most board wipes. You really need to be able to take its power and toughness down to 0 using -1/-1 abilities, or even just straight up exile, which there isn't a great deal used in the format outside of what's it called now? God damn it, Instant Speed, Anguished Unmaking. I've got it, I remembered. But also, Ulamog by itself, a 10/10, that's a 2-turn clock if our opponent has no blockers. But even if our opponent does chump block with tokens, when it attacks, defending player exiles the top 20 cards of his or her library. So, essentially, 3 turns minimum of attacks with Ulamog, and our opponent is going to essentially be milled out without them having anything to do about it, which is pretty sweet. So that's essentially the deck. Onto the mana base, we've got 3 swamps, 3 mountains, and 9 forests. 9 forests essentially because most of the deck is green. We need the double red and the double black in order to use some of our spells. So Obnixilis is double black, but we don't need it till later. Ribbons, double black, but we don't need it till later. Earth, probably don't need it till later, which is double red. So we've got 3 of every basic, just so that we can find them with our Explosive Vegetations and our Nissa's Renewals, that kind of thing. We also have Evolving Wilds as well, which allows us to grab whatever basic colours we need at the time. So, sack an Evolving Wild, search your library for any basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. You want to be playing these as early as possible, essentially. After that, we've got ourselves some sweet Smouldering Marshes, which are swamps and mountains. So that counts towards the basics, but that doesn't actually matter in this deck, unfortunately. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. We've got a lot of basics and a lot of ways to find them, so these are likely to be tap lands in the early game. Later down the line though, there's almost no chance in hell that they're not going to come into play untapped. We also have Cinderglades as well, which are the mountain and forest variation. Rogue's Passage, we've touched upon it. It's a colourless land, but also allows you to make creatures unblockable, and that is essentially the deck, guys. So if you did enjoy the look of the deck, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out the matches that should already be out as well. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon as well, right next to the subscription button, and that'll give you notifications when I release new videos. I do hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.